So the physical family is the first pillar of youth ministry, youth and family ministry. Let's take a look at this, talk about the second pillar of youth and family ministry. How do we get the faith family involved in passing on faith to our children?
Yeah, so a couple principles here that we can use. One, and this is a really big one, we want to encourage meaningful relationships between young people and older, mature Christians in the church. And so how this might happen could really depend a lot on the circumstance, but really we're talking about like mentors. We want to pair students with people who can be mentors in their lives. And I'll just put kind of a word of caution in. We also want to just be aware of the times in which we live, and we know a lot of things about, sexual predators and things like this, that we just have to be vigilant. We have to protect our kids. So we want to be wise as we go about doing that. But I do think there are ways in which we can do that wisely and safely, but where we can provide meaningful relationships between students and adults in the church. And this has shown to have long-term benefits as students then have more connections to the congregation as a whole. So then a second principle, we want to remove our young people from the worship of the assembly as little as possible. Now, this is a little different from what I was saying before. This is not another slam on children's church. Research has just indicated that one of the strongest correlations between long-term faith and another factor is regular attendance at the Sunday assembly. That is such a traditional thing to say that perhaps it sounds kind of ridiculous, but it really makes sense. If you want your kids to develop an understanding that church is important, they actually need to do it a lot. We tend to value the things that we spend our time doing. And
that sounds radical.
It does, doesn't it? So from a youth ministry perspective, and I mentioned this earlier, there are some youth ministries that seem to almost make it a goal to identify as many things to take them away from the Sunday assembly as often as possible. And I just don't think that's a great idea. I think hopefully a positive of this pandemic season that we've gone through is that perhaps we've seen the value in connecting in person. I mean, we're all thankful for mediums like this.
Right.
As you and I are discussing today, we're thankful that we have these, but they are substitutes. They're not replacements. And there really is value in being part of the assembly of God's people when we're worshiping corporately together. So I think it's important that we look at our youth ministry calendars and we try to structure them in such a way that we're actually here, we're present. We try not to be gone many times a year. And for families, I think it's really important that we structure our priorities to where we try to not be gone a lot. I mean, I've had students in the past who were very involved in things like, year-round sports. And I would have families who, in the course of a summer, maybe 12 weekends would be gone, 10 of those playing travel ball.
Yeah.
That has cumulative effects that we can't just undo or compensate in other ways, especially if then you're also gone, another dozen times throughout the year for other reasons. Mm-hmm. We need to be present in order to feel like we belong. And it's just not a surprise that at some point our students would check out to something that they weren't really a part of to begin with.
Yeah, definitely. Let me ask this. So by making sure that they're there, how, what are a couple of practical steps? I can see how somebody in a church would immediately think, okay, we want to we want our young folks to be here. That makes sense. We want them to be involved. I think inclusion is basically, one of the things, without having said the word, I think inclusion is one of the things that you've been talking about here.
Yeah.
By way of comparison, a lot is said about diversity these days, but I think the ultimate point of diversity is inclusion. An example would be this. I mean, it's nice for a suburban church to have, for example, a Hispanic ministry or something like that. But a lot of times the main church and the Hispanic church, they rarely do anything together. That's good. I'm glad you've given a space, that there's space for these for these folks, but they really are kind of parallel congregations. It's probably harder, but it's definitely more meaningful for there to be mutual inclusion, I would think.
Right.
So, rubber meets the road here. Do you have young people reading scripture? Do you have them saying prayers? Do you have them delivering communion? Do you allow them to stumble through some kind of public speaking role and let your professionalism suffer a little bit? Is that something we can? Are those things we can do?
I would say yes. I mean, I guess maybe I should have put a disclaimer out at the beginning of this that like almost everything I'm saying is kind of pre-pandemic and also kind
Sure.
of hopefully post-pandemic. I mean, that kind of all the rules have been thrown out in some degree, but absolutely. I mean, I think we should include our young people in worship in whatever ways that we can. And even beyond, I mean, I am talking about worship here. And so that's important, but like in all aspects of church life that we can and all sorts of ministry and whether it's helping to teach children's classes or being a part of some sort of service project or outreach ministry or something like that, just depending on what different churches are doing. I think a good question would be, hey, if we're going to do this, what is a way in which we could involve our students?
Mhm.
So they could be meaningfully involved now. And certainly in worship. I mean, different churches have different perspectives on this. At my previous congregation, for example, I mean, we did have some of our young men would be involved in public assembly, but like one Sunday night a month, it was called youth-led worship. And basically everything was done by our young folks. And that was something that they looked forward to and also provided opportunity for interaction with adults because we would have adults who would come before service and kind of pair up with students and mentor them and train them and help them to practice the comments they were going to make or
Yeah.
work on their songs or things like that. So absolutely. I mean, I would say yes, inclusion in that way. I would also say inclusion in things like song selection. If we have multiple generations present, it makes sense to me that we would sing songs that speak to multiple generations.
Mhm.
Obviously, there's people can get touchy about song selection, and I understand that. But one of the
Yeah.
truest things I ever heard was when it comes to the music we sing at church, probably no one should be happy all the time,
Interesting.
because we should be putting up with and singing songs that are not our favorites, but that we know are the favorites of other people that we know and love and care about
Mhm.
and who we worship with. So those are just some couple different ideas, but absolutely, I think you're on the right track when you talk about inclusion. We want people to feel included. We want them to feel a part of the church now, not just that they're biding their time until they can be a part of the church in the future, but they're a part of the
Yeah.
church now and they're recognized and valued now.
Yeah, that's something that I know a lot of folks have had to struggle with in the past. I had the advantage, and the main preaching minister that I work with, Mark Adams, he and I both grew up at the same congregation together, suburban congregation in Nashville, and we had the advantage of routinely hearing excellent sermons, excellent worship ministry. I mean, it was just a treat growing up in an environment where we had such a high quality available to us every Sunday morning. For a time, we were having some Sunday evenings where teens were able to do some things like what you've described. Eventually, that went away when we kind of broke up into our smaller. We didn't call them life groups; we called them home churches because that's basically what we were doing. We were the church, just meeting in our homes. I remember having opportunities to share even when I was in college,
Mm.
and I went with my parents to their home church where the next youngest person was my mom, and the age range older than her was like 25 or 30 years. And so, but I was blessed because I had an opportunity to listen, also had an opportunity to participate, had an opportunity to do all kinds of things like that. But I do know that some churches struggle with being able to let some of their younger folks do things because there is an expectation of whether you call it professionalism or quality or something along those lines. I almost wonder if we might need to be willing to really sacrifice some of that for the sake of including and involving some of these younger folks.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And look, I'll just say, I mean, I love to hear, really well done lessons by people who have spent a lot of time studying. And I love to hear high quality singing and things like this. But I think about Jesus, and I think about Jesus saying, let the little children come to me. And I try to balance that with all the times that Jesus valued things like professionalism and appearance. And
Yeah.
I mean, I'm just being transparent. Like I think that's a value that we have that I'm not sure that Jesus has. And so and I'm not sure that we have to make this dichotomy, but if the choice is between professionalism or involving all generations of God's people, including children, like
Right.
I feel like we have a pretty clear biblical precedent of which of those Jesus would value more. I mean, you
Yeah.
know what I'm saying? But I don't think that we have to choose that way. I mean,
Right.
I don't think that the barometer of are you involving your students is do you have an 8-year-old preaching on Sunday morning? Like, I don't think that that has to be the standard that we set.
Yeah.
I think that there are ways that we can involve them meaningfully and still honor people who have gifts and talents and have put a lot of effort and study into honing those things, and have a word from the Lord to present.
Yeah.
So I don't think we have to choose, but at the end of the day, Jesus had some pretty strong words about the way that we treat our children and the way that he values them.
Yeah. Very much so. I can see how this applies to really two people that Jesus selected for preaching the gospel. We have Paul, the highly educated Pharisee, and we have Peter, an eager, motivated, blue collar worker. Now, Peter probably wasn't educated at all in the sense that Paul was educated, but that doesn't mean that Peter was dumb by any means. I don't think that was the case at all. But we see Jesus spending a lot of time, Jesus willing to invest time and energy into someone like Peter in order to get him to a point where we see him in Acts, doing the things that Jesus had just spent the last several years working with him to do.
Yeah.
I can see that. Luke, as we kind of wrap up with our time here this afternoon, is there any last words of parting wisdom that you want to share with us? Any maybe like really great home runs or any great clinchers that you want to share with us from your book or something along these lines?
Yeah, well, there's a quotation that I'd like to share, just kind of to emphasize, we do see in Scripture over and over again, like we talked about, the physical family and the faith family being the ones who are given this task of passing faith on to the next generation. What I think is really encouraging is that research also indicates that this is successful. There's no guarantees that if you do the right things, your kids will come out perfect. That's not the way that life works, but there are really strong correlations. And so this is a quotation from a kind of a massive research study that's a little bit old now, over 10 years old, but just a really comprehensive study of the religious lives of young people. And it says that one of the key findings of the study is that in young people, spiritual formation occurs in two places: individual family households and multi-generational religious congregations. Individual family households, multi-generational religious congregations, or in other words, the physical family and the faith family. It really shouldn't surprise us that what God tells us to do in Scripture actually works.
Weird, right?
Yeah, right. But I'm hopeful. Personally, I'm hopeful that we really are kind of going through this shift. When I first started in grad school researching this to try to get better about youth ministry and get a better handle on what we should do, there wasn't a ton of research on this. And this is just about 7 years ago. Like I basically read everything I could get my hands on. And now I can't even keep up with all of the stuff that's being put out and the resources that are being published promoting this type of ministry, where we're really trying to incorporate our students into the overall congregation of the church and also equip parents. So I'm very hopeful that these are ideas that are really starting to have leaven in the church and are really having an impact over time. And I really appreciate you giving me the opportunity to share some today.
Well, I'm happy to do it. I know this is something that you've been passionate about for a while. And as fathers, you and I both have a vested interest in ensuring that our children come to own their own faith. And especially as ministers, we have maybe a better chance of initiating some of those changes than some do, or at least advocating for those kinds of changes to be made that we think can be effective toward this end. Luke, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon on the podcast. I really appreciate your time and appreciate the work that you've been doing. I hope that at some point in the future we might talk a little bit about some other topics that I'll run by you later, just so I won't commit you to anything here publicly. But until then, man, have a good rest of the day, and we'll talk to you next time. Okay.
I appreciate it, Kevin. Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.